Sarah Matthews was just an ordinary woman, living a life that many would describe as simple and peaceful. She worked as a waitress at a local diner, always wearing a warm smile and giving customers the best service she could offer. When she wasn't at work, she spent her time caring for her elderly mother, who had been in poor health for several years. Sarah's life had been one of routine, quiet contentment with little drama and few complications. She kept to herself, avoided controversy, and never sought the spotlight. Her life was modest, and she was content with that. But fate had other plans for Sarah. One morning, Sarah's ordinary life was upended when she received a letter in the mail. Her name had been randomly selected for jury duty. Like most people, Sarah wasn't thrilled about the idea of serving on a jury. She had heard the stories about long, drawn-out trials and the tedium of deliberations, but she understood that it was her civic duty. And knowing her mother needed someone to help her with daily tasks, Sarah decided to get it over with quickly so she could return to her normal life. Little did Sarah know that the trial she was about to be part of would change her life forever. The case involved a wealthy and powerful business tycoon, Alan Parker, who was accused of embezzling millions of dollars from his own company. The trial was highly publicized, and it seemed to everyone that it would be a straightforward case of financial fraud. The evidence against Parker was strong, and it appeared that the jury would easily convict him. But behind the scenes, a different, far more sinister agenda was brewing. The trial was presided over by Judge Ronald Harris, a man whose reputation was not just that of a seasoned judge, but also someone with deep ties to the city's elite. Harris had long been known for his connections to high-profile business figures, and it was widely whispered that he had a history of turning a blind eye to corruption as long as the right people were involved. What few knew, however, was that Judge Harris had been bribed by Parker's defense team to influence the outcome of the case. Harris had made a deal with the tycoon's lawyers to manipulate the trial from behind the bench. His plan was simple but devious. He would frame one of the jurors for misconduct, discredit them, and thereby create enough doubt in the jury to sway the final verdict in Parker's favor. To execute this scheme, Harris needed to target a juror who seemed harmless and inconspicuous, someone who would never raise suspicion. Sarah, with her humble background and her unassuming presence, was the perfect target. She wasn't a lawyer, she wasn't involved in any high-profile circles, and she didn't have the sharp legal instincts that others in the jury might have had. To Harris, she was the ideal candidate, someone who could be easily manipulated and framed without anyone second-guessing the accusations. Judge Harris started his manipulative tactics subtly. He would frequently direct his attention towards Sarah during the trial, asking her questions in a seemingly innocuous manner. He would often give her knowing glances, trying to plant the seed that she could be trusted with certain details about the case. Sarah, not understanding the full implications of his behavior, thought nothing of it. She was just another juror, trying to keep up with the trial and do her duty. However, Harris's true intentions became clear on the third day of deliberations. Out of the blue, Sarah was accused of misconduct. It was alleged that she had been sharing confidential trial information with outsiders, specifically discussing the case with her mother, which was strictly forbidden by the court's rules. The accusation was completely false, but it was enough to create a scandal. The media quickly caught wind of it, and the public, unaware of the judge's manipulations, began to believe the worst about Sarah. In the eyes of the judge, this accusation was the perfect way to throw off the entire jury. If Sarah were removed from the jury for alleged misconduct, the jury could be swayed, and the other jurors could potentially start to doubt the strength of the case against Alan Parker. The plan was a brilliant one, relying on the assumption that Sarah would simply crumble under pressure. Little did Harris know, he had just set the stage for an unlikely showdown. The moment Sarah was accused, she was removed from the jury deliberations and sent to sit alone in a holding room, where her mind began racing. Something didn't sit right with her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the accusation had come out of nowhere and seemed oddly convenient. She wasn't the type of person to break the rules, and she certainly hadn't discussed the case with anyone. As the days passed, Sarah's suspicions grew. She started to piece together the judge's strange behavior, the defense team's odd strategies, and the inconsistencies in the case. A growing realization dawned on her: she had been framed. But she wasn't about to let it slide. Sarah wasn't a lawyer, but she had a sharp mind, and she had spent years reading legal books and learning about the law as a hobby. What she didn't know about the law could fit in the palm of her hand, but what she did know, she could use to fight back. Now, with her back against the wall, Sarah was determined to expose the truth, and the judge, who had underestimated her, had no idea what was about to hit him. It started with little things, details that Sarah didn't think much about at first. During the trial, Sarah noticed that Judge Ronald Harris seemed unusually fixated on her. Whenever the courtroom was in session, his eyes often lingered on her, scanning her reactions more intently than those of the other jurors. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. After all, judges were supposed to observe the jurors. But this was different. His gaze was more pointed, almost as though he were trying to gauge her thoughts, waiting for a reaction that would give him some insight into how she was leaning. Sarah tried to brush it off, thinking she was being paranoid. But then on one occasion, Judge Harris singled her out. While the other jurors were silently reviewing their notes, he asked Sarah a seemingly innocent question in the middle of the proceedings, one that had nothing to do with the legal arguments being made. "Miss Matthews," he said, his voice calm and measured, "do you find the defendant's testimony credible?" Taken aback by the unexpected question, Sarah stammered a response, her eyes darting around the courtroom. The other jurors glanced at each other in confusion. It wasn't typical for a judge to single out one juror during the trial, let alone ask them about their opinion on the case while the trial was still ongoing. The defense attorney gave Sarah a quick smile, his eyes narrowing as he observed the exchange. Sarah felt a sudden unease, but she quickly brushed it off, telling herself it was just part of the process. However, as the days went on, Sarah began to sense an increasing level of discomfort. There was something off about the way Judge Harris was conducting the proceedings. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, or how he asked her questions. There was a subtle manipulation behind his actions. He was testing her reactions, subtly guiding her thoughts, almost like he was preparing her for something she wasn't yet aware of. On the third day of deliberations, the tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. As the jury began to deliberate on the case, Sarah was once again singled out by Judge Harris, this time in a far more serious way. He called her into his chambers, away from the rest of the jury, and in front of her, he accused her of misconduct. "Miss Matthews," Judge Harris began, his tone cold and authoritative, "we have evidence that you have been taking notes on the trial outside of the jury room and sharing them with outsiders. This is a violation of the rules and an attempt to influence the jury's decision." Sarah's heart dropped. She was utterly confused. She hadn't done anything of the sort. She hadn't spoken to anyone outside the jury, nor had she taken notes outside of the courtroom. It was an absurd accusation, one that didn't make any sense. But it didn't matter. Judge Harris's words had already set the wheels in motion. The judge immediately ordered that she be removed from the jury, citing her alleged misconduct as grounds for dismissal. The news of the accusation spread like wildfire, causing an uproar in the media. Headlines blared Sarah's name, and soon the public was debating whether she had broken the law or if she was simply a scapegoat. The media painted Sarah as someone who had taken advantage of her position on the jury and tried to influence the outcome of the case. The public was quick to judge, believing the judge's accusations without question. Sarah, the quiet, humble woman from a small town, was now the center of a scandal. While the media painted her as a rule breaker, little did anyone know that this was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan. Judge Harris, in his arrogance, thought that by accusing Sarah of misconduct, he would discredit her and create enough doubt in the jury's mind to sway their decision. If Sarah, a seemingly insignificant juror, could be painted as someone untrustworthy, the entire case could be undermined. But there was one crucial thing that Judge Harris didn't realize. Sarah was not just a simple waitress. She wasn't the naive woman he thought she was, and she wasn't about to let herself be railroaded. Sarah had a secret, something that the judge had no way of knowing. While she may have seemed like a quiet, unassuming person, Sarah had spent years learning about the law as a personal hobby. In her spare time, she had studied legal textbooks, watched courtroom dramas, and even taken a few online courses in legal studies. It wasn't something she shared with anyone, not even her closest friends or family. She had always considered it just a personal interest, a way to engage her mind and escape the monotony of daily life. But now, that knowledge was about to serve a far more important purpose. Sarah knew exactly what was happening. She understood that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate attempt to frame her, and she wasn't going to let it slide. What Judge Harris didn't realize was that Sarah wasn't as helpless as she appeared. She was determined to expose the truth, and with her legal knowledge and sharp mind, she began to devise a plan to turn the tables on the corrupt judge who thought he could use her as a pawn. The battle for justice had just begun, and Sarah was ready to fight. The game was on, and Sarah Matthews was about to show Judge Harris that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. Sarah Matthews had never practiced law, nor had she ever set foot in a courtroom for anything other than jury duty. But while she wasn't a lawyer, she was far from ignorant when it came to the legal system. Sarah had always been fascinated by law and justice. While taking care of her elderly mother, she often found herself reading legal textbooks, studying famous cases, and watching courtroom dramas on TV. The idea of law had captured her imagination, and although she had never pursued it as a career, she had become well-versed in the basics of legal proceedings. Her hobby wasn't something she discussed with anyone. It was just something she did to keep her mind active and engaged. However, it was this deep interest in law that would prove to be her secret weapon when she found herself at the center of a massive courtroom conspiracy. When Judge Harris accused her of misconduct, Sarah's mind immediately went into overdrive. She knew that the accusation was not only false, but that it was part of a larger, more sinister plan. The way Harris had singled her out, the way the media quickly turned against her, none of it seemed like a coincidence. Sarah had learned enough about legal strategy and courtroom procedures to recognize when something was amiss. She realized that this wasn't just an isolated event. It was a calculated move by the judge to manipulate the outcome of the trial. Sarah wasn't the kind of person to back down in the face of adversity. Instead of retreating into fear and silence, she decided to take control of the situation. She knew that the key to proving her innocence was to fight fire with fire, using her knowledge of the law to expose the true intentions behind the judge's actions. With her sharp mind and meticulous attention to detail, Sarah began to observe everything about the trial. She paid close attention to every word spoken in the courtroom, every gesture from the judge, and every action of the defense team. Sarah was no longer just a passive observer. She was now an active participant in the case, gathering information that would help her clear her name and uncover the corruption she had begun to suspect. She started by taking detailed notes. Sarah had always been good at keeping track of information, and she used this skill to document every inconsistency and irregularity in the trial. She noticed how Judge Harris seemed to favor the defense, bending the rules in their favor and allowing them to introduce questionable evidence without proper scrutiny. She also observed how the defense team seemed overly confident, as if they knew the outcome of the trial before the jury had even deliberated. This wasn't just a typical courtroom drama, it was a carefully orchestrated scheme to manipulate the verdict. As Sarah dug deeper, she began to notice more troubling patterns. The tycoon, Alan Parker, whose wealth and influence seemed to shield him from the consequences of his actions, had given testimony that seemed scripted and rehearsed. His answers were carefully tailored to avoid direct responsibility, and his story seemed to change depending on the questions asked. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Parker's defense team was doing everything in their power to distract the jury from the core facts. It became clear to Sarah that the trial was not a fight for justice, it was a fight for power. Judge Harris, with his deep ties to the business elite, was using his position to ensure that Parker would be acquitted no matter the cost. And Sarah, caught in the middle of this corrupt scheme, was the unwitting pawn. But Sarah wasn't about to let herself be used. Armed with her knowledge of the law, she began to document the discrepancies in the trial proceedings. She made detailed notes about Judge Harris's behavior, especially his interactions with the defense team and his irregular decisions regarding the evidence. Sarah carefully noted every instance where Harris had seemed to favor the defense, from allowing inadmissible evidence to disregarding established legal protocols. It became evident that the judge was not merely overseeing the trial. He was actively involved in manipulating it. The next step in Sarah's plan was to track the inconsistencies in the tycoon's testimony. She began cross-referencing Parker's statements with the evidence presented in the trial. It didn't take long for her to spot glaring contradictions. Parker had claimed that certain documents he had signed were falsified, but Sarah knew that those documents had been authenticated by multiple credible sources. His story was falling apart, but no one in the courtroom seemed to be noticing. Sarah wasn't just gathering evidence to clear her name. She was building a case to expose the corruption at the heart of the trial. She knew that the accusations against her were a mere distraction, a way to discredit her and manipulate the jury. But what Judge Harris didn't know was that Sarah was no ordinary juror. She wasn't going to let herself be framed. She would use her knowledge of the law to expose the truth, to show that the trial was nothing more than a sham. As Sarah continued to piece together the puzzle, her confidence grew. She wasn't just a simple waitress from a small town. She was a woman with a sharp legal mind and an unyielding sense of justice. The more she uncovered, the more determined she became to fight back and prove that, even in the face of powerful corruption, the truth could prevail. But the stakes were high, and Sarah knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She would have to navigate the treacherous waters of courtroom politics, outsmart a corrupt judge, and take on a defense team that had already proven their willingness to bend the law. But Sarah was ready. She had the skills, the knowledge, and the determination to see this through, and to expose the corrupt system that had tried to frame her. The battle for justice was far from over, and Sarah Matthews was just getting started. Armed with the knowledge she had painstakingly gathered and the undeniable evidence of corruption, Sarah knew that the time had come to take action. But instead of rushing to expose the judge's actions to the authorities immediately, Sarah chose a more strategic approach. She realized that she could use her position on the jury to her advantage and build a case from the inside out. In the next round of deliberations, Sarah took a deep breath and prepared herself for the most important legal maneuver of her life. With the confidence of someone who knew the law inside and out, she began to subtly challenge the information presented by both the judge and the defense team. At first, it was just small observations. She pointed out contradictions in the judge's instructions to the jury, questioning the legal reasoning behind certain decisions, and highlighting how the facts didn't line up with the instructions given. Her tone was calm, her approach methodical, and at first her fellow jurors were unsure how to react. But as Sarah continued to speak, her deep understanding of the law became clear. She was no longer just a juror, she was a legal force to be reckoned with. She even started referencing case law that was relevant to the case, drawing parallels between the tycoon's defense and previous legal precedents that had been used to dismiss similar claims. Sarah's references to case law stunned not only the defense team, but also Judge Harris. The judge, who had grown accustomed to controlling the narrative in the courtroom, suddenly found himself unable to dominate the deliberations. His careful manipulation was being exposed, piece by piece, by a woman he had underestimated. Sarah's sharp legal knowledge began to sow seeds of doubt among the jury. She pointed out flaws in the defense's arguments that no one had previously noticed. She exposed the discrepancies between the tycoon's testimony and the evidence that had been presented. With each point she made, Sarah slowly began to dismantle the defense's case, much to the discomfort of both the defense attorneys and the judge. The jurors, once unsure of their own understanding of the trial, now saw the evidence in a completely different light. Sarah had guided them through the legal nuances of the case, showing them how the judge had played a pivotal role in manipulating the trial to favor the tycoon. It wasn't long before the jury, once focused solely on the facts at hand, began to question everything they had been told. They began to see the larger picture, how the trial was not just about the tycoon's guilt or innocence, but about a corrupt judge working to manipulate the outcome from behind the scenes. Sarah's quiet, methodical approach had completely shifted the tide of deliberation. What was once a trial that seemed headed toward an acquittal now felt like it could be a turning point in the fight for justice. But Sarah knew that the only way to truly expose a judge's actions was to find irrefutable proof. After days of carefully monitoring the trial and observing every small detail, Sarah uncovered a critical piece of evidence that would change everything. While reviewing her notes from the trial, she stumbled upon something that made her heart race, a hidden email trail between Judge Harris and the defense team. The emails were a damning revelation. They contained detailed instructions from the judge to the defense attorneys, offering advice on how to manipulate the case, including how to present certain pieces of evidence in a way that would confuse the jury, and how to distract attention from the strongest points of the prosecution's argument. But most shockingly, the emails contain explicit references to framing Sarah as the scapegoat in the trial. The judge had been working with the defense team to create the false accusation against her, using her as a distraction to ensure the trial's manipulation went unnoticed. With her hands trembling, Sarah knew this was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. She immediately gathered the evidence and, with the help of one or two trusted jurors who had come to believe in her, she presented the email trail to the rest of the jury. The room fell into stunned silence as the jurors read through the damning exchange. It was clear that the judge had not only been complicit in the defense's scheme, but had actively participated in orchestrating the entire plot. With the evidence in hand, Sarah knew that it was time to act. She approached the foreman of the jury and demanded that they present this new evidence to the court. The foreman hesitated, but Sarah's conviction was unwavering. The jury agreed to hand over the evidence, and the next day it was presented in the courtroom. The courtroom erupted in chaos as the emails were read aloud. Judge Harris's face drained of color as he realized his plan had been exposed. The defense team was left in stunned silence, unable to respond to the bombshell revelation. The judge, who had once been the unquestioned authority in the courtroom, was now the one on trial. The prosecutor immediately filed charges of judicial corruption and conspiracy, and Judge Harris was swiftly arrested. The media, which had once vilified Sarah, now hailed her as a hero. The story of how she had turned the tables on a corrupt judge and exposed a massive judicial conspiracy made headlines across the nation. Sarah Matthews, the woman who had once been a simple waitress and juror, had become an unlikely champion of justice. The day after the explosive revelations came to light, the courtroom was abuzz with activity. What had once been a straightforward trial involving a wealthy business tycoon and his alleged embezzlement of millions had now turned into a national scandal. The trial was immediately declared a mistrial, and all charges against Sarah Matthews were dropped. The judge who had orchestrated the entire plot, Judge Ronald Harris, was disbarred and arrested, his reputation in ruins. But the most astonishing turn of events was the reaction from the public. Sarah Matthews, who had once been vilified as a criminal and a rule-breaker, was now hailed as a hero. The media, which had relentlessly portrayed Sarah as the villain in the story, quickly shifted its narrative. Headlines that once painted her as a disgraced juror now celebrated her as an unlikely champion of justice. Social media platforms erupted with support for Sarah, with countless people sharing her story and praising her courage in the face of overwhelming odds. What had initially been a scandal surrounding her name had turned into a story of triumph, not only for Sarah, but for anyone who believed in the power of truth and the strength of one individual to change the system. Sarah's actions had not only saved herself from the false charges that threatened to ruin her life, but they had also exposed a deeply corrupt system that had allowed powerful figures to manipulate the law for their own gain. Her ability to use her knowledge of the law to fight back against a judge who thought he could control the outcome of the trial was nothing short of extraordinary. She had taken on the most powerful adversaries in the courtroom, the judge, the defense attorneys, and a billionaire tycoon, and she had prevailed. Sarah's story became a symbol of how one person, armed with knowledge, courage, and determination, could take on even the most powerful forces in society and emerge victorious. Judge Harris's downfall was swift and complete. The authorities launched a full investigation into his role in the trial, uncovering a pattern of corruption that had been going on for years. It turned out that Harris had not only been involved in this particular case, but had also been using his position to influence other trials, taking bribes and manipulating the judicial process to favor those who could afford to pay. His collusion with the defense team in the Parker case was just the tip of the iceberg. The scandal sent shockwaves through the legal community, leading to a broader crackdown on judicial corruption across the country. Several other judges who had been involved in similar schemes were investigated, and many were subsequently removed from their positions. As for the business tycoon, Alan Parker, the revelation of Judge Harris's involvement in manipulating the trial left him with no defense. The case was reopened, and after further investigations, it was revealed that Parker had indeed embezzled millions from his company using complex methods to hide the fraud. With the corrupt judge out of the picture, the prosecution had the upper hand, and Parker was eventually convicted. His empire, which once seemed untouchable, crumbled, and he faced a long prison sentence for his crimes. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't in seeing her accuser fall, or in witnessing the tycoon's downfall. It was in knowing that she had fought back against a system that had been stacked against her. Sarah had always thought of herself as an ordinary woman, someone who lived a simple life and stayed out of the spotlight. But through her intelligence, resilience, and unwavering commitment to justice, she had proven that appearances can be deceiving. She had shown the world that even the most unlikely person could stand up against injustice and make a real difference. In the months that followed, Sarah's name became known across the country. She was invited to speak at legal conferences where she shared her story and her lessons learned about the power of knowledge, courage, and standing up for what's right. She became a symbol of hope for people who had been wronged, a living testament to the idea that one person could change the course of history. Her story inspired countless others to take action, to believe in their own abilities, and to never give up, no matter how powerful the forces aligned against them might seem. The legal community also took notice of Sarah's actions. Her detailed understanding of the law and her ability to navigate the complexities of the courtroom had not only exposed corruption, but it also highlighted the importance of legal literacy for the average person. Sarah became an advocate for legal education, encouraging people to learn about their rights in the legal system, not as lawyers, but as informed citizens who could protect themselves and their communities. In the end, Sarah Matthews' victory was far more than just a personal triumph. It was a victory for justice itself. She had exposed the flaws in a system that allowed powerful individuals to manipulate the law for their own benefit. She had shown the world that the quietest voices could have the loudest impact. And she had proven that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's determination and knowledge could stand up to the most corrupt forces in society and prevail. Sarah's story became a powerful reminder that justice is not always guaranteed, and that sometimes it is up to the individual to ensure that truth and fairness prevail. And while she may have started